How blessed I am, and thank you very much, dear. This picture here needs maybe a word of explanation. It's Poseidon, the Greek statue of Poseidon. It's in the museum in Athens. And to my way of thinking, although this doesn't do it justice, of course, but in my view, it is one of the most beautiful of all man-made objects. It is absolutely perfect. And it relates to some of the things I'm going to say, because it is an attempt in Greek art to represent the archetype in human form. The archetypes, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, the archetypes are ideals of perfection. And when you actually see the statue itself, that is an ideal of perfection. I don't know of any other work of art even that comes anywhere close. And I'm sorry that our illustration doesn't do it justice, but there are many very good illustrations in any book on Greek art which you'll be able to see, and I think probably take a similar view to myself. I was asked actually to follow up, in a sense, the presentation I gave at our last conference, but if you didn't hear that, it doesn't matter in the least, because this one will, I hope, stand on its own. But the point that I'm trying to get across, really, is the nature of the Western tradition within transpersonal psychology. I have to say right at the very outset, please, that this is not an attempt to criticize any other traditions. I spent 30 years of my life studying Eastern religions, practicing Eastern religions, going on retreat in this country and abroad, and I have a tremendous admiration for all faiths. I'm very much in tune with Fraser Watts this morning, and I particularly responded to his presentation because it said so many of the things in which I believe myself. So I'm not criticizing the Eastern tradition. I'm certainly not criticizing anybody who follows that tradition, and I'm not trying to say that any one tradition, Western or East, is the one that you should choose. This is very much a matter of individual and personal choice. But what I will say about my studies of the Eastern traditions is that when I came back to look at the Western tradition, I understood it very much better. There was a great deal in the Eastern traditions which, for me, helped to illuminate the Western traditions and open my eyes on all sorts of possibilities that I had missed within the Western tradition. One of the great strengths, I think, of looking across the traditions in the way that I have done, and I know many of you have done, is that one sees the similarities. I agree again entirely with Fraser Watts this morning that we shouldn't arrive at a kind of messy synthesis of it, or little bits and pieces, a kind of mix and match process, going to the supermarket and taking the little bits that we want and rejecting the bits that we don't want. I agree very much with Fraser that by remaining in a tradition and learning it really well, it's better than taking bits and pieces from everywhere and not learning any of them properly. So that's really my disclaimer right at the very beginning. I'm not in the business of criticizing anybody or any faith or any belief. But why is it important to look at our Western tradition? That is really the purpose of my presentation. Why is it so important? Why have we neglected it within transpersonal psychology, really, at our peril? Transpersonal psychology has looked towards the East, and it has looked towards the East for very good reasons, because of the particular picture that we have of the Western world now. And if my assistant here would bring up the first of our slides, you can see I'm not very experienced at presenting things in this way. When I started as a young lecturer in university, we all used OHPs, overhead projectors, and we thought this was absolutely the most modern thing available. And one of the things I was always taught was you never leave your slide on when you've finished talking about it. And I'm old-fashioned enough to ask Claire, who's handling things, and Kendall at the back, to actually turn the slide off after we've had a look at it before we go on to the next one. So in a sense, I'm using it as an OHP rather than as a PowerPoint presentation. But if we can go on to the next one, there is, I'm afraid it's rather condensed there, a list of, in a sense, the reasons why things appear to have gone wrong with Western culture. But we can see beyond those. But let's just go very, very quickly and briefly through them. It's materialist reductionist scientific and philosophical models of reality, that we are nothing more than biological accidents. You know, I've used this phrase before, but I'm rather pleased with it, so I'm going to use it again. Biological accidents cast adrift in a world without meaning or purpose, living without purpose and dying without hope. That is, in a sense, the materialist reductionist view, that this is all there is. There is nothing more, and that anybody who believes there is something more is just being superstitious and deluding themselves and others. Secondly, that somehow our Western scientific models have disproved the existence of soul and of the survival of physical death, and I should say of God, of the divine. Nothing could be further from the truth. Physical science is a very, very powerful tool. I'm trained as a scientist, as we all are, and I have a great admiration for the scientific method. But it stops short at the moment of death, and it stops short at the brain. It is not equipped to deal with the things that go beyond. So, in a sense, it has nothing to say about whether there is a soul or not. It has nothing to say about whether there is a God or not. It has nothing to say about whether we survive death or not. And in the recent attacks, Fraser made reference, of course, to Dawkins this morning, but in these recent attacks on the whole concept of religion, a great deal of ignorance has been revealed. Now, I don't mind ignorance. We're all ignorant of an awful lot of things. I'm terribly ignorant of a great range of things. Ignorance is okay. We can't know everything. It's all right not to know. In fact, not knowing is often the best place at which to start. Ignorance is okay, but ignorance that pretends to be knowledge, that is not only misleading, but is actively wrong and actively unscientific. So the pronouncements of people like Dawkins on religion have no validity at all. They don't take us anywhere, they don't go anywhere, and they don't come from anywhere except his own particular agenda. The third one, the claim that religion and religious explanations are redundant and hinder scientific advance. I'm going to refer to this a little bit later. But religion is not an opponent of science. There is no need for any kind of conflict. And again, as we shall see later on, were it not for religion, and in the Western tradition, particularly Christianity over the centuries, science would not have advanced. Because Christianity was the guardian of science rather than the opponent of science. Granted, things went wrong at some particular points in history, but for the most part, we rely historically upon the fact that the Christian tradition in particular was actually the guardian and very often at the forefront of the exploration of the natural sciences. The brain is the seat of consciousness. Well, again, science doesn't really have very much to say about that. But I really sometimes almost despair when I hear people on television, for example. Nicholas Humphreys did it the other day. Nicholas Humphreys said that the brain is the seat of consciousness is the only game in town, and did it in such a dismissive way. You know, anybody else who thinks differently is absolutely misleading themselves and deluded and living in the dark ages. That was the impression he was trying to give. It is not the only game in town. It certainly is not the only game in town. Just as strong, just as powerful a game is the idea that mind and brain are separate. As you know, one of the models that's often used for this is that the brain is rather like a television set, and the signal is sent from elsewhere. Of course, if you damage your television set, you damage the reception, but you're not damaging the signal. The signal itself is something separate and different, and is simply received by the television set. And in the same way, in terms of that model, the brain is like a kind of reception, a receptive mechanism that takes the thoughts from a separate mind, which is non-physical, and therefore survives the death of the brain. If there is nothing more than the brain, then we don't survive death at the end of the life of the body and the brain. That's the end of us. So the brain is the seat of consciousness. This is another of the ideas within the West that, in a sense, has inspired people to begin to look east and to virtually despair on a Western tradition, which now seems to end up in this sort of level. Nature is the passive tool of humanity. This is absolutely appalling. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, so I don't need to say much about this. But the idea that nature is simply there for us to use instead of there for us to serve, will lead, if we carry on as we are doing, of course, to the destruction of the planet. And it is very, very simple philosophy that tends to drive these things. Plus, of course, money and the availability of money and the mechanisms and all the things that we were talking about the other day, Clive. But the principle is that if the philosophy is wrong, that the earth is simply there to be exploited, that's what we're going to do until we've exploited it to destruction. Consumerism as the path to happiness. Well, we all know that owning things and gaining things and having things and possessing things does not lead to happiness. I remember being told very many years ago that the pursuit of happiness does not lead to happiness. And these simple bits of revelation are so obvious. The pursuit of happiness doesn't lead to happiness. And certainly the pursuit of consumerism doesn't lead to happiness. Modernism in the arts at the expense of aesthetics. I always feel, as many do, that the arts represent the spirit of our culture in so many ways. The creative arts are enormously important. The creative arts, I think, psychology and religion, this is the area of transpersonal psychology. But if one looks at modern art, then one may very well ask oneself, what is it trying to do? What is it for? Does it inspire us? Does it uplift us? Does it provide revelation? And so on. And if the answer is no to all these things, then we're driven to the point, I think, of concluding that the arts is no longer fulfilling its function. The primacy of behavioral and physiological models, well, we know about that. The demythologizing of religion by many theologians. I'm not so much aware of that, but the Christian church in the West has put itself on the defensive. It's put itself on the back foot. It's playing the game, in a sense, of ignorant critics. It's trying to accommodate to other points of view. Cupid was the best example of this, wasn't it? With his idea of religion as a kind of social construction. It was just a nice way of behaving socially. But there was nothing more to it than that. It was certainly circumscribed by the boundaries of physical science. And again, when life comes to an end, so does the soul, so does the spirit. Well, that actually isn't a religious philosophy. It is not a spiritual philosophy. All spiritual philosophies, all religious philosophies, in all the great traditions, take the same view that there is far more to us than the grave, that we go on, that we survive. And the latest book, as Ingrid said, that I've been working on for all its faults and all its problems, and a very difficult book to write, but it was trying to look across the great traditions and at other things like near-death experiences, deathbed visions, the way in which people die, the visions that they have as they're passing from one world to the next. All these things tell a very consistent story about the existence and persistence of the soul. So this attempt to demythologize religion, I know we all enjoyed Fraser Watts' presentation, because here was a man who really lived his religion, a very, very leading scholar, a very leading scientist and philosopher, a man who lived and believed and was thoroughly identified with his faith, and was not afraid to say so. And you imagine standing up in the common rooms and so on of Cambridge University and always being true to one's own beliefs. I admire him enormously. Objective rather than subjective reality. Well, actually we live in a subjective world. Our only experience is a subjective experience. We do not experience things objectively. We only experience things by taking them inside our heads and putting them inside our own subjective world. And then we can begin to understand them. But this taboo against subjectivity, Alan Wallace wrote a very good book on this very subject, The Taboo of Subjectivity, recently. The idea that we must not talk in subjective terms. And we know that within psychology, it was the behaviorist movement, important as it is in its own way. It's very important to study behavior. But it was the behaviorist movement that took us away from any readiness to accept that subjective experience was valuable within psychology, and more than just valuable, that psychology is built upon subjective experience. Shared, if you like, shared as best we can, but subjective experience nevertheless. A rejection of the sacred in favor of the mundane. You know, we almost apologize by talking about the sacred these days. We almost apologize about these things. Why should we apologize about the sacred? The great traditions, and the Western tradition has been very much to the fore in this, all the great traditions say that everything is sacred. Everything is sacred. Nature in particular is sacred. Nature is what we depend upon. The lovely image of nature as Mother Earth. This is a tremendously important image, a tremendously important symbol. Nature is our mother. Nature is God-given. It is God's gift to us. We are parasites, in a sense, upon nature. And instead of being grateful to nature for what she gives us, of course, we pull her apart. I remember Ronnie Lang, towards the end of his life, it must have been, I suppose, just a few months before he died, and I was at a presentation by him, and we talked quite a bit afterwards. And he said, if you want to study nature, try loving her instead of tearing her apart. Those are the words of a wise man. If you want to study nature, try loving her instead of tearing her apart. As indeed, that's equally true of any relationship between two people. Try love instead of tearing each other apart. And finally, rationality and logic rather than intuition and revelation. Again, we as psychologists, we tend to be apologetic about intuition and revelation. But again, as Fraser was saying this morning, in science, many of the great discoveries come through intuition. Intuition means an inner teaching. These things arise within the mind. And I've always stressed to my students that the mind is the greatest mystery, really. We honestly don't know where thoughts come from. One moment we have no thoughts in the mind, next moment a thought arrives. Where does it come from? We don't actually know. Where was the thought before it came? And when you sit in meditation, this is one of the great beauties of meditation, when you sit in meditation, you sit in this silent space, and for some seconds perhaps, nothing arises in this space. And then a thought arises. Where does it come from? When I had one of my earliest interviews with the Tibetan Lama, he said to me, look for the source of your thoughts. Look for the source of your thoughts. Where are they coming from? What is actually happening within the mind? We are mostly strangers to our own minds, strangers to ourselves. And that is because we do not sit quietly on a cushion, on our own, and just allow ourselves to be there with our own minds, with our own consciousness. And it's all there again in the Western tradition. And I'll say something about meditation in the Western tradition shortly. So the consequence of all this is that transpersonal psychology tends to be rather ignored by our colleagues within psychology because they see us as flaky and turning towards New Age stuff, which is very much driven by usually a misunderstanding of Eastern ideas and Eastern philosophies, a kind of woolly thinking which is related to supposedly New Age philosophies. Actually, the Eastern traditions and philosophies are very, very tough indeed. When you really get into them, there is a tremendous discipline there. It's not flaky at all. But when you get this little sort of mix and match philosophy, then you end up with something that is pretty flaky. And as a result of that, we in transpersonal psychology are regarded as being somewhat flaky. God, it's like magic. It just happens. Oh, modern technology is wonderful. Yeah, I don't understand it. I've no idea how anything works, but it's just great that it happens. Thanks. So, as a consequence, then, we are not seen as embedded within our proper tradition and answering our colleagues from within that tradition, as well, if you like, as drawing upon other traditions. But in fact, Western culture is based upon transpersonal values. I was very fortunate in that I studied the arts before I did my psychology degrees. And one of the things that I studied as part of my degree was history. All psychologists should study history because history tells us why we are where we are now. And as you study history, so you realize more and more, gosh, throughout history, the values there are based upon the transpersonal. And I shall say a little bit more about values in a moment. But the transpersonal is embedded still in our society. And the Christian church And here I'm getting closer to what Fraser was talking about this morning. The Christian church is the guardian and has been the guardian of that tradition. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, had it not been for the Christian tradition, art, architecture, scholarship, social compassion, the work with the poor, the work with the sick, hospitals started in the monasteries. Leper hospitals, looking after lepers. Nobody else cared about them. They were supposed to wear a sign saying unclean and go around ringing a bell so people could get out of the way. It was only the monks who cared for them and the nuns who cared for them. So the whole social fabric was built upon the compassion and the concern of the Christian faith and the Christian tradition. And Tarnas, I think it was Les yesterday mentioned Richard Tarnas. Was it? Where's Les? Les, was it you who mentioned Richard Tarnas? Yes. An extraordinary book, tremendous tour de force, wonderful book. Well, if we can put up the next slide. Well, I don't know. That is actually a Jung slide. So we've missed the Tarnas one, I think. But it doesn't really matter because I can tell you what's in it. So what Tarnas is saying, in effect, is what I have been saying a moment ago, that it was the Christian church who really preserved our culture. Without it, the modern world would not have been, or all the better parts of the modern world, would not have emerged. Can we just turn our back upon our history in this way? Can we pretend, in a sense, that all that has gone before to make us what we are actually never existed, because now we're looking in a quite different direction? Well, we may if we wish, but if we do, then we make an enormous mistake, because we are the creation of that culture to a large extent. We can actually, if you can put on this one, this is Jung's approach to the subject. Instead of learning the spiritual techniques of the East by heart and imitating them, so he's stressing right at the outset that it's a bit artificial when it's grafted onto the West. It would be far more to the point to find out where there exists in the West an introverted tendency similar to that which has become the guiding spiritual principle of the East. We should be in a position to build on our own ground with our own methods. If we stretch these things directly from the East, we've merely indulged our Western acquisitiveness, confirming yet again that everything good comes from the external world. And this is really a feature, the extroverted feature of the West, the acquisitive nature of the West. We're always trying to grasp things from outside. We in Britain, of course, were a colonial power, and our colonialism was based not upon imperialism. It wasn't based upon the wish to dominate. It was based upon trade. We followed the trade routes. In many cases, other people, the Portuguese, for example, had done all the discoveries. They'd done the hard work. And we followed on in the interest of trade. So it's all been a matter of drawing in from the outside, grabbing, if you like, selecting and grabbing what we want. Whereas, as Jung is saying, for goodness sake, look within. That's how the East has progressed. It is more through the introverted than the extroverted method that the East has known and understood the value of looking within. When we actually begin to search in the Western tradition, we find that that's here as well in the West. But we have certainly neglected it. So although Jung was very, very much in favour of Eastern philosophies, as you know, volume 11 of the Collected Works, which is a wonderful book, I'm bowled over by Jung. A lot of it really is simply based upon his own views and opinions, which is presented as if it is scientific or psychological fact. But my word, it's so convincing. I mean, here was a man who saw through things, who saw beyond the normal reach of the human vision. And that's a sign of genius, of course, a sign of greatness. Turned it off. And, well, you can actually put it straight onto the next slide. I think we can move on again. It's pathetic, really, isn't it? You know, that I need somebody to do this for me. There we are. Yeah. A first-year undergraduate student could do this for themselves. But anyway, Jung insists that turning to the East at the cost of our own culture, we abandon the one sure foundation of the Western mind and lose ourselves in a mist of words and ideas. I love his language, or at least the translation of his language by R.F.C. Hull, who was an absolute genius in the way he did these translations. In a mist of words and ideas that could never have originated in European brains and can never be profitably grafted upon them. And then he goes on to emphasize this point with an extraordinary quotation from The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a journal of alchemy, Chinese alchemy. It's an extraordinary book, full of all sorts of practices for change and self-transformation, some of which could be pretty dangerous, I think, if you practice them on your own. You do really need a teacher if you're going to go into that stuff. But it's a wonderful book. And he pulls out the quotation, if the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. If the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. So it isn't just the means that make things right, it's the person who is using the means as well. And so if we take on, for example, if we were trying to do all the practices in The Secret of the Golden Flower, this would not only be very dangerous, but would probably mislead us and certainly divert us from working within a tradition which we could understand and make proper use of. The Dalai Lama was once asked, well, more than once he's been asked this, the question by a Christian, what can I do to become enlightened? And he, in his extraordinary compassion and wisdom, said, be a better Christian. Be a better Christian. He didn't say, no, give up your Christianity, come and be a Buddhist. That's the only way you can get enlightened. No, be a better Christian. And I must say, with all the Buddhists that I've worked with, certainly Tibetan Buddhism, which is the area that I'm most familiar with, in addition probably to Chinese Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, I've never found anybody trying to, or any of the great teachers trying to proselytize. They don't actually want Westerners particularly to give up everything that they know and understand and follow an Eastern path. Culture itself, because these things are so culturally based, culture itself comes very much from environment, from climate, from all the various things in the physical world which influence the way in which a society grows and develops. And the topography, the climate, the geography, etc., of the Western world is very different from that of the Eastern world. And so it is quite natural that the cultures are going to develop in very different ways. It's important to understand our differences if we want to understand our similarities. We're never going to do it otherwise. If we pretend that there are similarities when in fact there are not, then we're never going to make very much progress. So the Western tradition itself is based in the Western world. It's based geographically in the West. It grew out of the West. And as you know, its roots go back to the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and then, of course, the Greeks, and all the civilizations that grew up around the Mediterranean basis. They believed the Mediterranean Sea was the center of the world. And indeed, it was the center of the world. It was the center of their world, which is why they called it Mediterranean. It was the center of their world. And there was an extraordinary flowering, an outburst, if you like, over a relatively short historical period of amazing cultural advances around the Mediterranean basis, which we're going to look at in a moment. The Greeks, the Hebrews, all contributed enormously to this flowering, to this development. They came together in creating, of course, the culture of the ancient Greeks, which we tend to see as the center point, really, of Western civilization. And there, I think, in a way, there was something else that was added, some other revelation, in a sense, if you like. Something else happened. In addition, of course, to being built and developed on what had gone before, something else appeared to happen at that time, which transformed, in a way, Western culture over a relatively short period of time. And as a result, there were new ways of looking at nature, new ways of looking at man, new ways of looking at human destiny, new ways of looking at the soul and the relationship with the gods. And these were the things I talked about last year, really. The development of myth as a way of helping one to understand realities which could not readily be put into words. Myths are stories that tell us things that we would not be able to understand immediately, certainly at a rational level. We can try afterwards to rationalize them, but the intuitive impact of the myths and legends, just like the intuitive impact of poetry. If you want to look at some of the cultural differences between East and West and so on, look at the poetry. And if you're not very interested in poetry, look at the music. Look at the differences that have developed in the way in which the creative arts are used as an expression of the human spirit. One of the simplest examples, because I'm pretty certain all of you love them, is the Japanese haiku. They're beautiful little poems which say so much in a matter of just 2 lines, 17 syllables, whatever it is. The haiku didn't develop in the West, but the narrative poems didn't develop in the East. Lyrical poems, love poems, didn't develop in the East. So the East and the West, through their culture, showed the deep level of their differences. You can say, and I think quite rightly, that yes, but if we begin to unpack all this cultural business and so on, we find that there are all sorts of underlying similarities, and I agree entirely with that. But it's in the interpretation, it's in the detail and so on, that we find the differences. So these influences came together then in Greek culture, and something else was added. One example of this, Rudolf Otto in 1926 called it the numinosum. The numinosum. And if we could have the third Jung slide. This is how Jung defined the numinous or the numinosum. A dynamic agency or effect not caused by an arbitrary act of will. In other words, it doesn't come from us. It doesn't come from our will. It seizes and controls the human subject, who is always rather its victim than its creator. It's something from outside. An experience of the subject independent of his will, explained as due to a cause external to the individual. The numinosum was the revelation, or it is a way of expressing the revelation, a way of putting the revelation into words. There's something happened that outside the human subject, it seizes and controls the human subject. We see it in the cults of Dionysus, that extraordinary Greek cult that then developed into the Bacchanalian cults of the Romans. It was a cult of divine intoxication. And in medieval Europe, if we jump ahead several centuries, we find the same kind of thing amongst pilgrims, or pilgrimage, as it was called, pilgrimage. Groups who just set off, and they said, we seek the Lord, we know not whither. We don't know where we're going, but we're seeking the Lord. And with great joy, they tramped the countryside, seeking the Lord. They knew something was going to happen if they put themselves in the right frame of mind. All the techniques within the West, and I think this is true of the East as well, depend upon putting oneself in the right frame of mind. I know they can happen spontaneously sometimes when they're least expected, and maybe one could say, well, the right frame of mind was not involved then. In the West, we would say, well, that's an act of grace. Things do happen sometimes as acts of grace. But for the most part, they happen to the prepared mind. In meditation, one sits in meditation, one opens the mind, and one waits. In the Christian tradition, it's called waiting upon the Lord. It's a lovely phrase, waiting upon the Lord. You know, just sitting, not expecting anything, but opening the mind and waiting upon the Lord. So the numinosum then makes the individual rather its victim than its creator. Victim doesn't mean anything in a nasty sense. It means just that it happens to him rather than is created by him or her, of course. And I should also say, before I leave this particular point in history, the tremendous emphasis upon the feminine in spirituality, which we have rather lost since then. But there was a tremendous emphasis upon the priestess. And in the oracle at Delphi, for example, in the mystery cults of Demeter and the Bacchanalian, the Dionysian cults, the women led the way. The priestess, if you like, was the one who was in touch with the gods. and this was even the case if we go back to the Egyptians. The priests interpreted, but it was the priestess who was the channel, the link with the gods. It was through her that the revelation came. And this links in so well what Les was saying about the feminine in the Kabbalah and the link between the masculine and feminine. And we needn't get, I suppose, too caught up in the fact whether the feminine actually refers to the woman and the masculine to the male, because we all have masculine and feminine inside us. But in the days of the Greeks, the Egyptians, the mysteries and so on, it was the priestess. And the suggestion is, rightly or wrongly, that she was a medium, that indeed she was a channel, and that this came more readily to women than to men, because women are perhaps more intuitive than men are. So the influx of revelation came from this recognition that things are coming from outside rather than created by the human mind itself. The mystery traditions developed techniques. Now, these techniques remain a mystery. They were supposed not to be revealed on pain of death. And so we are still ignorant as to what the mysteries actually involved. We have certain hints and whispers, but no more. And the hints and whispers that we have suggest that they involved out-of-body experiences. And Apuleius, in the classic book, the Golden Ass, Apuleius was actually initiated into the cults, into the mysteries. And he does say a little bit about it. And he talks about passing the threshold between birth and death. So that it was an experience of what it was like to die and what you experienced after death. And rather like near-death experiences now, which happen spontaneously sometimes to people when they go through a short period of clinical death, then one actually knows what it's like to die. And as we understand from people who've had near-death experiences, the fear of death is usually removed completely. They say, no, I've died once, I know what it's like. And in many cases, again, as you know, they only came back with great reluctance. Didn't really want to come back here. They're quite happy to stay where they were. So they involved out-of-body experiences, and they involved magic. Now, magic is very central to the Western tradition. And when we think of magic, we think of silly little parlor tricks and silly magicians drawing rabbits out of hats and things like that. No, magic was not that. Magic, which comes from the magus, the magi at Christ's birth, for example, it was simply to do with transformation. All magic was to do with transformation. It was changing something from one form to another. And it linked in, of course, quite closely with alchemy, which in its physical manifestation was base metals into gold, but its real purpose was the transformation of the human spirit. And in this Western tradition, we get increasingly, as we look across the centuries, this idea of change. Something had to change. And that something, when it changed, was not just a matter of learning something, as when we sit in a classroom and change as a result of learning. All learning involves some element of change. No, it wasn't just that. It was a complete transformation. And those of you, I think, who had some of these experiences will know what I'm talking about. It is a complete transformation. And things are never the same again afterwards. Even Carlos Castañeda, in one of his books, The Journey to Ixtlan, he talks about the magician there and the lonely life of the magician. Because once he has changed, he can never go back to where he was. And the magician can never find his way back to Ixtlan. He can never go back to the person he was because he's been transformed, because he's been changed. So the concept then of transformation was a magical concept. And there were certain ways of working magic. Interestingly enough, music was recognized very early on as a magical act. And of course, we know that music can transform consciousness. You know, you look at the music in the Western tradition. The work of Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Mendelssohn. These men were giants, absolute giants. And you listen to their music, and it does have this transforming effect. Within the church itself, church music, and most of the great musicians wrote for the church, partly because they were paid to do that, but also out of their own deep faith. You only have to listen to Bach's B minor Mass. God, he was a man who not only believed, he knew. Bach knew, certainly. And all the great music, great church music, changes the consciousness. The Gregorian chant. Listen to the chant. Sit in a cathedral, sit in a large parish church where the chanting is going on. And you can feel this alteration in consciousness. Trouble is, as psychologists, we often stop the process from taking place because we say, well, it's just this sort of imagination, it's just a bit of fantasy, it's this, it's that, it's an illusion, it's whatever. No, stay with the experience. See where it takes you. See what happens. So transformation was the keynote of magic. It was intended to transform, and there were techniques and there were rituals for effecting this transformation. And many of these rituals were preserved by the Christian church. It was said that within the Christian church, the symbolism within the Western Christian church is absolutely remarkable. You go into a church when you're on your own, when there's nobody else there. Unfortunately, a lot of churches are locked up these days, but many of them have at least one morning a week when they'll be open. You go in there on your own and look for the symbolism. What is the church saying? You're entering a sacred space. What is that sacred space saying to you? The symbols are conveying something to you which is beyond words. And within the Christian tradition, of course, the Eucharist is one of these great symbolic moments. In the Anglican tradition, of course, it's said that what happens, at a symbolic level, is that one is initiated into the mysteries of Jesus Christ. In the Roman Catholic Church, transubstantiation teaches that the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. But whichever way one looks at it, if one enters into the Eucharist in the right frame of mind, then something may happen. But if one enters into it thinking, well, this is only a little sip of wine, and it's only a little wafer of bread, that's all, it's nothing else. Nothing will happen. No, nothing will happen. Nothing will happen. It depends so much upon the nature of one's own mind when one enters into these initiatory experiences. What time are we due to finish now? Because we have to go over to it at 7. Oh, my stars. Really? Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Yeah. We started a bit late, didn't we? We were supposed to start at 1:45. Okay, we'll go to 10 past. Are you sure? No. Well, I'll try and I'll try and finish in about 10 minutes, just to leave 5-10 minutes for questions then. Yeah, right. Now, also, again, jumping a little bit here, I won't be able to use perhaps some of my slides, which is such a shame. Oh dear, yeah. They hang on, we're not ready for that yet. We've got some of these slides here on the handouts. They just need putting in order. So if we can leave them out for tomorrow, and they can be on the desk there if anybody wants to take them. But again, one of the things that arose from this sort of work was the idea of the archetypes. Now, people think Jung invented archetypes. Of course, he didn't. It was and Les will know about this, the Judeo-Christian philosopher Philo-Judaeus, who first introduced the idea of the archetypes. And his idea was that they provide the basis for the soul's destiny. They provide the basis for the soul's destiny. It was building upon the idea of Plato's idea of forms, that in the heavens there are perfect versions of everything associated with life itself. And it is those perfect versions, the ideals, which really mean the forms, the ideas of Plato, further developed in this concept of archetypes. They provide the basis for the soul's destiny, and they endure once humanity is purified. So this is the transformation. One is initiated into the archetypes, and the archetypes are the pure ideals of goodness, of love, of purity, of truth, all those things that we hold dear, and all of which we know and recognize in ourselves how far we fall short. I usually try and say when discussing these sorts of things with people, and they say that they are very concerned that whatever they didn't do the right thing or something or other. And Fraser was talking about this business really of forgiveness this morning, forgiving oneself. The answer is we are not perfect beings. We are very imperfect beings. We are doing our best. We're trying. We're very imperfect beings. And the step forward is the recognition within oneself of where one falls short. That is the important first step. You recognize within yourself. And you recognize within yourself that you could have done better. But you don't blame yourself for not doing better. You simply try next time, of course, to put that right. So that you are, in a sense, forgiving yourself. And one of the things in the Christian tradition, which I think probably we don't find to the same extent in the Eastern traditions, is, as Fraser Watt was saying, the idea of forgiveness. That ultimately we are not good enough to do it all ourselves. We need help. We need help. And that help will come from outside us through the spiritual transformations that take place. So the archetypes, then, were these ideals which were in the heavenly realm. Now you may say, well, yeah, but this is the heavenly realm, ideals, or all these things. Well, before we dismiss them, ask yourself where the moral code and values of the human race, or certainly the Western tradition, where they come from. Where do they come from? To the Neoplatonists, the idea was that they were a reflection of the perfection of the archetypes itself. And Jung's idea of archetypes really picks up on this. He considered that they are the inherited basis within the unconscious, and that they express themselves in the form of symbols because they are beyond words. And so we have to accept and use and work with the symbols. But the idea of the archetype certainly was that they were the ideals of perfection. Now, what is the alternative in the Western tradition to the idea of the archetypes as the origin of perfection? Well, there are about 3 or 4 main contenders. One is utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, the greatest good of the greatest number. The greatest good of the greatest number. Well, that sounds okay, but then you can justify euthanasia, you can justify cannibalism, you can justify killing off the old people who are no longer productive. That's still the greatest good of the greatest number. That's utilitarianism. Do we get our moral code from utilitarianism? No, we don't. There's something finer in us that says, no, these things are not right. It's not right to kill off the weak. It's not right to allow the sick to die. It's not right to destroy old people simply because they're old. It's not right to kill handicapped babies. We are not working. Utilitarianism does not enthuse us. It does not fill us. It does not inspire us. We would not be happy with ourselves living in that kind of philosophy. So utilitarianism doesn't seem to work. Neo-Darwinism is another alternative, that we are all machines programmed by evolution. We are biological machines programmed by evolution. I quote word for word one quite active neo-Darwinian. We are biological machines programmed by evolution. In other words, we have no free will, nothing at all. We are biological machines. And when our clock runs down, our inner clock runs down, that's the end of us, and so on. Well, does that work? Do we respond to that? Do we relate to that? Do we listen to Bach's music or read great poetry and think that was written by a biological machine programmed by evolution? Even if we ask ourselves the question, why on earth should that benefit survival? If it is simply part of being a biological machine, why should that have survived? Why should that evolutionary process have taken place that has preserved it, that part of us, for today? So that doesn't really work. What's the other one? Well, we're running rather short. The cupboard's getting rather bare. But it would be sophistry. The sophists were a great movement within Greek philosophy. And they were really the opponents of the Platonists. Because in their view, there was no absolute value. There was no external value. Truth was purely relative. The needs of the individual dictated behavior and what was right and what was wrong. Well, that's consumerism, I suppose, in a sense now, isn't it? Sophistry. So those are 3 competitors to the Western tradition, going back to Plato, through the Christian church, of course, and back to the Greek idea of the ideals and the archetypes. That there is something, there is a code that is given to us, and it is in and through that code that we live. Again, you can take your choice. I'm not trying to convince anybody. If you are a sophist or a neo-Darwinian, and if you're happy with that philosophy, well, that's your approach. But from the Western point of view, that has not been the transforming and the sustaining process that has ensured our own existence. But for those Western values, many of us would not be here. We would never have lived, nor would our parents, nor would our grandparents. But for those ideals, poverty, chastity, and obedience, look at them how you like within the monastic tradition, and then the way in which that was expressed in the world outside, through the leper hospitals, through, of course, the seats of learning. The universities were all based upon the church and the church's ideal of scholarship. Finally, then, last 2 or 3 minutes, now we find, if we look at the modern Western tradition, as expressed by people like Fraser, we find that it emphasizes affirmation, not negation. It's not getting out of things. It's affirming life and working in and through life itself. It emphasizes, and this is the one, I suppose, big difference between the Western tradition and some of the Eastern traditions, because the Western tradition affirms the self. It affirms the self. Ingrid showed me some years ago, and I've always remembered it, and we often refer to it when we're chatting, a wonderful quotation. What you are is what is God's gift to you, and what you become is your gift to God. So make what you can of yourself. We are work in progress. We are work in progress. The Western tradition says we do not simply go back to wherever it was we arose from. Our lives have a purpose and a meaning, and in and through our lives, in somehow we add to the whole. We add to the unity. We are, if you like, facets. I know this sounds rather grand, but facets of a diamond, in a sense. And so the diamond becomes more beautiful with the addition of each facet. So Western Christianity has always emphasized this idea of perfecting oneself as a gift to God. Individuality and diversity. Again, within the Western tradition, there is not just the idea of the one, the unity, the mystical experience of the one, but also the diversity, the individuality, the colour, the variety that is also important and in some way adds, in the end, to the mystical concept of the one. And we pass beyond the idea of unity and diversity. These are only human terms. You work with what you have, and I've tried to deal this a little bit in the book that I've just tried to deal with on the afterlife. What you become at the end of all that, I remember my brother and I were having an interview with Swami Bhavyananda, a Hindu sage and great teacher. And my brother, who always asks these questions, what's it all for, where are we going, why are we doing this, and so on. And Swami Bhavyananda smiled, and he said, I tell you, you find God, and then you ask him. You find God, and then you ask him. Well, the emphasis is upon the work. You've got to do the work. You can't expect these answers necessarily just to be there, just to be given to you. Emphasis as well upon other power. Sorry, I'm skating through this. Other power rather than just self-power. We do find this in Buddhism, in Pure Land Buddhism, a wonderful, wonderful philosophy that by being a disciple of Amitabha, using Amitabha's mantra, Namu Amida Butsu, which is the Japanese version, you can be reborn, not back on this earth, but in his Pure Land, where the next step to final enlightenment becomes easier. Pure Land, which is the strongest, I think, or certainly the largest school of Japanese Buddhism, says, rather like Christianity, you can't do it yourself. You do need help. In this degenerate age, we can't do it ourselves. So you have to learn how to ask for help and how to open yourself so that you can receive help. Well, I'm going to have to stop there, I'm afraid. There's more left unsaid than has actually been said. But it's a kind of helter-skelter ride through the qualities and values, or some of them, of the Western tradition. And the emphasis, or the idea, or the conclusion that I'd like to leave with you, is that we are enormously fortunate in our tradition. We have a tradition of inestimable beauty and richness here in the West. And whatever we are looking for, we are going to find. We're looking for meditation. There is a tremendous tradition of meditation in the West. The Desert Fathers, the monasteries, the use of the Jesus Prayer, which is at the center of meditation in the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox Church. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy. And you are taught how to use the Jesus Prayer. And by asking for that kind of mercy, one is making a sacrifice of oneself through hope and through trust upon a power greater than oneself. So we have enormous richness. We have enormous benefits in our beautiful, wonderful Western tradition. And we as transpersonal psychologists, even if we don't use it ourselves, we must be aware of its value and try and share this with others. Thank you very much for listening.